And so when you are dealing with the entire sphere of knowledge production, we can see that it has taken a shape with the emergence of active domains of production and comparison. And there are three spheres basically. One is the informal open source communicative ecology. The second is a regulatory system, both informal and formal, which are assigning values to the knowledge. And third would be the commercial knowledge markets formalized in conventional terms. Now, let me get back to some of numbers just to put India, just to situate India in the global map. In this particular table, what I have intended to show that the gross expenditure on R&D compared to China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, UK and United States, the percentage of GDP. So if you find the India, the second column after the year, we find that it has more or less remained stable after reaching a peak in 2006. I don't have the time series, but broadly we can say that it has more or less remained stable. China, we have had a very rapid growth from 0.56 to 2.07. I'll get back to China in the next slide. Russia, you can see there's an increase, marginal of course. Brazil, more or less the same. South Africa, more or less the same. USA is of course hovering around 2.8 and UK is a slight increase. So what we find, I mean, I'm tempted to compare with China, that once it was being, I mean, it is still being considered, I mean, in the circle that China would overtake USA when it comes to the gross spending on R&D. China has targeted 2.5, but USA we saw that is around 2.8, but China might overtake over a period of time. What is important here, that 8% of China's R&D goes to the universities, which is half of USA's. This comparison is important. And most of the R&D resources are dedicated for the state-controlled enterprises that is argued to be driving the Chinese economy. And a part of this, in fact, I don't have a table, but the China, in terms of the publication in the English medium journals, had a very fast growth, 15.4% or so annual rate of growth. And this expenditure, 8% is earmarked for the universities, but the remaining would ultimately trickle down to the universities, and that is spurring the growth in terms of the publication. This table is meant for India alone, and here we see the sector-wise composition of gross expenditure on R&D, higher education, government and business enterprises. And the last row shows what was presented in the last table, that is the expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP. So in terms of composition, what we find that for higher education, it's a marginal increase from 3.4 to almost around 4%. Government share has come down from 74% to 53%. And business enterprises has actually witnessed a rise. I will get back to the why business enterprises could be explained. We'll get back to later. It is almost from 23% to 43%. This is the compositional change when it comes to the overall expenditure that you are spending on R&D by these three entities. What is the scenario in the higher education sector today? Based on the previous NAC report, it could be safely argued that almost 2/3 of our universities and the 90% of our colleges are below average. But when you are comparing what percentage of GERD are being allocated for higher education, we find in the OECD is around 20%, China I have already mentioned 8%, Japan 15%, and India is around 4%. So China is hovering around 8 to 10%, I can see. And so the 55% of total expenditure are for the science agencies and the government funded labs. But when you are looking at the overall higher education system in India, we have to understand that the center state disparities in funding university education is pretty huge. The central funded universities are pretty well off, but the state universities are finding it very difficult under the fiscal regime which believes in fiscal deficit, I mean restriction of fiscal deficit in terms of the GDP. Now how world over, you know, when you are trying to look at how do you channelize resources for R&D, these are the two major strategies that we find, but I will see the reflection of these two strategies in the Indian context. One would be you are using the competition to drive differentiation and concentration in the existing top institutions. So the idea would be that you reward the quality. Let there be competition. Competition would lead to a valuation of the university, and valuation of the university would attract funding from the government, and government would say that, look, you have done well, so you should better be funded. And the second would be that you choose the universities, you build new capacities in the old and new. And this is called picking the winners. But the Indian scenario, I can safely argue that both the strategies are being adopted. On the one hand, we have, I mean, in the second one, the easy example would be some of the funds that our department gets, and the University of Potential for Excellence and Research and the DSA and CAS at the center, and the rewarding quality has not yet been implemented, but this is being mooted to be implemented. This is in the form of the graded autonomy, which has been already mooted by UGC, and when it comes to the picking the winners, the government of India initially it conceptualized world-class universities, but now they have replaced the world-class university, saying that we should set up, the government has said we should set up 20 Indian Institute of Eminence, ultimately with the objective to occupy space in global higher education, and 10 from the private and 10 from the public. This is important because the entire university system is being categorized, so that the resources would be channelized based on their potential, based on the performances. And this is how the future, when you are looking at the teaching, research and research concentration within the university system, these are the policies which will play a very important role. I don't know whether it is going to be implemented, but it's being, I mean, there's a possibility. So these are the three categories of the university: category 1, category 2, and category 3. And category 1, the NAAC score beyond 3.5 or above, or ranking, the National Institutional Ranking Framework, the top 50, and the category 2 between 3 and 5, and category 3. I'm not going into the details of the policies, but what it seeks to argue that the category 1 would have the freedom to determine the fees, to recruit the foreign faculty, to have 20 to 30% of the students from abroad. There will be many more such changes, and incentivization of the faculty salary. So it will be, all these category 1 universities will be restructured in a radically different way. Now let me, I mean, overall, what are the changes being taking place with regard to the third? Do I have time? 2 minutes. Very briefly, this is the mode of funding, and you can see here that the two questions are being important. I will not elaborate on this. One is that what is being funded, whether the input is being funded or output is being funded. For JNU, for example, it is the input which is being mainly funded, because the teacher salaries are being directly credited by the MHRD. But increasingly, if you look at the this pattern of funding, which has implication for the conduct of research and the research outcome, we are moving from input based funding to the output based funding when it comes to what is being funded and how is it being funded. We are moving from a centralized to a more market based, and each of these therefore will have different implication for autonomy in doing research and autonomy in what we teach. And so therefore the mode of funding will change or will influence the behavior of the scientists and the teachers, and accordingly what we do and what we intend to come up with. In the global university ranking, very briefly, the time is short, what's happening that there is a concentration of the best of the minds, the teachers and the students at the top of the ranking. So therefore when you look at the world ranking, it is very, very stable. And this is how the top of the universities are in a position to attract the best of the minds, and huge amount of resource funding. The endowment of Harvard, MIT, Rochester would be pretty large, and they have got the best of the people. So the market and the global ranking, in fact, they are reinforcing each other to stabilize or consolidate this particular hierarchy in the system. And in a one way, when the universities are being rewarded for original research because it's a peer reviewed publication, but at the same time market is getting into the realm of the university a bit later. Briefly about autonomy in doing research in social sciences. Very briefly, I will not go by point, but what is important here, who is funding is very important, and what objective the funding agency has in undertaking or in commissioning a social science research project is very, very important. Because Increasingly, we find the emergence of the think tanks, particularly privately funded, and government is also increasingly relying on the think tank to undertake research. So therefore, the think tanks are playing a larger role, and the objective of the funding agency is very, very important, because in social sciences, we very often locate ourselves within a theoretical paradigm to do research. And this choice of theoretical paradigm has got very serious implication for the policies that we undertake. The last two slides very briefly. And this intrusion of the market forces in the realm of the university has got very serious implication for the conduct and the research outcome. This is a study based on India, a very recent study, Mitra and Sharma, Cambridge University Press book. They are saying that, look, a part of the increase in expenditure on R&D by the business sector could be explained by that the business sector have resorted to manipulation of what is permissible for tax benefit calculation, for tax exemption. What they do, they include the manpower under the item what is actually meant for innovation. So it is very easy to inflate the expenditure by including the manpower expenses, and which is not actually innovation, but they get the tax benefit. So this is an unfair practice that they are saying, and what we find that the studies indicate that since the technology is largely imported from abroad, there are a lot of cost involved in installation of the machine and absorption of the technology, but these expenditure are not helping other than the tax benefit at all, this industry. In the context of the US, Washburn 2005, corporate corruption of higher education, arguing that, look, it is not a problem that university and industry are working together when it comes to the funding of research and what they do, but the problem is that the distinction between industry and academia is not very strict, it is getting blurred. Some of the examples from Washburn: universities market faculty their invention to earn royalty and profit, they invest their endowment money in risky startup, venture capital, all of you know, run the industrial park and for profit companies. And some of these problems appear in social sciences also, but more about sciences. So the corporate funding, when it is being directed to the university, they come with strings attached. So therefore, there is a natural tendency on the part of the faculty at the university to cede control over the research to these companies. And there are many examples in that book by Washburn: the suppression of information regarding health threats, delayed publication, and most of the universities are spending in US, but only 24 universities, around 24, 25 universities have been able to succeed. But a lot of resources are going into this. Faculty are paid to endorse the product, put their names on the papers, goes written by the industry. Non-tenured jobs is a very serious problem because they are emitting adverse signal to the researcher. Internship time has gone up, that is why, and to the teaching community. Increased propensity for undertaking safe project rather than less fundable ones with uncertain but potentially path-breaking outcomes. Teaching in the process is getting ignored. Humanities and social sciences are getting less budgetary allocation. Predatory journals, particularly in India, I am talking about, is a serious compromise with the quality. Let me end by this. Dasgupta and David. Economists understand technology less deeply than some might hope, but they understand the world of technology far better than they do the world of science. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. Questions or comments?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, please. Please. No, sorry.
Quick question, sir.
Yeah,
Did you drop Schumpeter purposely, or did you think Schumpeter?
I had Schumpeter in the earlier, but in this PowerPoint, Schumpeter creative destruction, I deleted. Now I should not have. It was on the second slide, yeah. I mean, of course, I should have referred to the Schumpeter, because how, this creative destruction can explain not only growth, but the industry's dedication of resources for innovation, and in particular. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Good one.
What I found interesting was, the continuity between Professor Zurana's talk and your talk, because somewhere he ended by saying that we are now witnessing a systemic shift for say at least past 20-30 years, and I think that is very true in the world of science and technology. And with you, your presentation especially got to the economics of it and the funding part of it. I think it actually brought it out very well. It illustrated further what this shift is like. But somewhere, I think some of these things can be said much more forcefully. And it's not just with technology, but even science these days has become a commodity. And there are several scholars who have worked on how science needs to be seen as a commodity in recent times. That's all.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.